So with respect to judgment and the various views about judgment, I want to make a few remarks that I think are important to keep in mind. Now, DBH and others like him understand judgment as being remedial in nature. So for example, on page 116, he uses the phrase remedial chastisement. Let's unpack this remedial view of hell just a wee bit. Specifically, let's ask some questions. What follows, or what would follow, from a remedial view of hell? And is the remedial view of hell correct? Now, in everything that I'm about to say in this thought experiment I'm about to propose, I'm not saying that this is exactly what DBH is arguing or how he's arguing. Now, he does think hell's remedial, but he's not necessarily going about that argument in the way that I'm about to play with. Okay, I'm just bringing this idea up as a thought experiment that we can unpack a little bit more for our discussion. So one might say that hell is intended by God to be a remedial state of existence. And if that is the case, one might presume that it follows that hell will not be infinite. It will not be eternal, right? Well, I think we need to be careful in saying things like that. Even if hell were remedial in nature, even if the goal of hell was to correct souls and thereby bring them to heaven, it does not follow necessarily that hell will not be eternal, right? I mean, this seems clear to me, at least. I mean, it's possible for people not to respond to correction. Isn't that right? At the very least, it's not unreasonable to suggest that such obstinacy to correction could conceivably go on forever and ever. So it seems to me that in the present time, God does allow people to rebel against him for whatever reason. I mean, I suppose that God desires his creatures to love him and to experience his love. Well, if that's the case, and it is, then of course that would entail his creatures have some sort of significant freedom. And this significant freedom makes it possible for meaningful choices. At any rate, suppose that people in hell have this same sort of freedom. This not only seems possible, it does seem likely that that would be the case. After all, their being in hell would only be just, in any sense of the word, if their choice to be there was a meaningful choice. And meaningful choice is contingent, of course, upon a certain capacity for significant freedom. So suppose that people have significant freedom in hell. And further suppose that at least some people choose to rebel against God forever. Here's the deal. In order for universalism to be true, everyone has to be saved. But in order for universalism to be false, only one person needs not to be saved. And it is not inconceivable to suggest, not least based upon the scriptural evidence, it's not unreasonable to suggest that at least one person will choose to be without God for all eternity. Now here's the deal. This thought experiment about hell that I've just proposed is one that works even if you have a remedial view of hell. Even if God intended hell to be corrective in nature, it does not follow that everyone will respond positively to his desires. It all depends, of course, on a person's view of freedom here, and that's the real issue, I think. And of course, I'll outline my views later on freedom. But is hell, strictly speaking, remedial? Well, I tend to think it's not. I actually think that something else is going on with hell. Something more is going on than this. It's not because I think God doesn't want all people to be saved. Of course God wants all people to be saved. He is love. How could he not want people to be united with him? I actually think that hell is simply God granting to rebel creatures their choice of a final no to him. Part of the way I conceive of free will, thanks to other scholars who have written on the subject, is that I think that freedom entails a host of certain other beliefs. One of these entailments is that of the efficaciousness of our decisions. What I mean by that is that in order for a creature to have significant freedom of praise and blame, then their decisions must be, in some sense, consequential. They must be decisions, they must be able to make decisions that at some point result in some consequence, right? They have to be decisions that are efficacious. And so if God grants people genuine freedom, and I think he does, then it follows that at some point, if a person genuinely does not want God, then God will grant them what they want. You might say that God has to grant them what they want because of the way freedom works. Now, let me pause for just a moment. People often get a little uneasy when we say that God has to do anything, mainly out of the fear that it implies that God is weak or is subject to conditions outside of himself. But that's not what I mean when I say that God has to give people a final no or anything like that. That's not what I mean. When I say that God has to, in this context, what I mean is that God has to in the logical sense. God has to grant people their decisions because he has already granted them freedom of the will. In other words, freedom of the will entails consequences for decisions made. And so if a person chose to say a final no to God, then it follows that God, at some point at least, since he has granted them freedom, he will have to give them what they want. Otherwise, he has not granted them freedom. Here, let me give you an illustration, and it may help. Suppose that God desired to create two lines that intersect one another. Now, based on this decision, it necessarily follows from this that God, by creating two lines that intersect one another, must also create angles. The creation of angles is entailed in the creation of intersecting lines. You just can't get around that. God cannot do the logically impossible, in other words. So if God has granted significant freedom to his creatures, and if one of those creatures rebel finally, then it follows that he will give them exactly what they want. So recall my discussion how all this works in that video I did on the wrath of God. It's not that God is strictly speaking doing anything when he dishes out wrath. What I tend to think is that he's just allowing rebel creatures to feel the full effect of their sin. He turns their sin back on themselves. Again, go check out that video that I did on the wrath of God. Again, I'll try to unpack all my views on freedom in another video, so hold tight on that. But my only point presently is to share two things. Number one, I don't think the remedial view of hell is accurate. I think rather that hell is a state of being where creatures who have said a final no to God have simply been granted what they want. And secondly, even if the remedial view of hell were correct, I can conceive of it still being eternal. In other words, a remedial view of hell does not necessarily entail a temporary hell, and it does not necessarily entail universalism. Just food for thought. At any rate, back to DBH. I continue to say that I have much to learn from him. He's a truly gifted thinker, and I really appreciate some of the things that he says. But I don't think he's right on his main thesis about hell. I don't think he's right about universal salvation. I mean, I really wish that he was correct. I wish that he was right. I wish I was wrong. But I don't think that universalism, at the end of the day, I don't think it works, unfortunately.